Marla Thorne had become something of shadow in Ember Hollow, the sort of woman whose name lived only in the town ledger, and the whispered caution to children told not to stray too close to the edge of the woods. Her cottage sat where the map gave up, past the frostbitten apple orchard, beyond the leaning graveyard gate, just at the lip of the old quarry where the wind grew teeth and howled like a creature lost to time. Once, long ago, before the fire and the silences, people had sought her out for needlework. Wedding dresses, morning shawls, baby bibs soft as milk lace. But now only the wind knocked at her door, and only the cats ever stayed. She had not always been this still, this faded thing stitched into the fabric of her own solitude. There were days when she'd laughed so freely it startled the birds from the thatch. Back then, the scent of lavender and starch clung to her fingers, and her back ached only from too much joy, dancing in the kitchen with Elias to the tune of the wireless, baking bread that left the windows fogged and the neighbors jealous. They had planned a life as if nothing could break it. A child by summer, a new loom by winter, a field of daisies stitched into the hem of everything they touched. Then the mill fire came, unexpected and cruel, swallowing half the hillside and everything she'd ever called certain. It spared the structure of the factory itself, as if mocking her loss, but devoured Elias in its greedy, blinding heat, leaving behind only a charred bootlace and the scent of smoke that clung to her lungs for months afterward. Her body kept moving, out of obligation more than faith, but something essential in her had turned to ash beside him. Afterward, the house grew quiet in the wrong ways. The bed felt too wide, the hearth too cold, the child she had carried in secret, the one she had not told even Elias about, unsure of the hope of hold, left her weeks later in a spill of blood that soaked through the floorboards and into the dirt below. She did not bury it. She could not. She simply wrapped what remained in linen and laid it inside the empty cradle Elias had built with calloused hands and a pocket knife, the one carved with tiny wooden foxes. Then she closed the nursery door and never opened it again. Years passed, or perhaps it was only seasons disguised as lifetimes. She began feeding the strays one winter out of desperation more than mercy. They came in pairs at first, skittish little things with ribs like harp strings, eyes bright with suspicion and hunger. She left scraps on the porch, crusts of bread, slivers of dried fish, a hard-boiled egg cracked in half like a kindness. They returned the next evening, and the evening after that, until eventually the porch became a small parliament of purring creatures, some with half-tails, others with notched ears or coats scabbed with past fights. She named none of them. She gave them her silence, her scraps, and her warmth, and in return they gave her presence, movement, the sound of something living. It was not companionship, not really, but it kept the edge off the grief. The kittens grew bold. One slept in her sewing basket, another on the pillow beside her cheek. She let them. She no longer cared about appearances or dignity or what the town thought of the widow, who preferred cats to conversation. Occasionally, someone from the village would send up a parcel, a sack of flour, a bar of soap, a note with no signature, but Marla never responded. The door stayed shut. The curtain stayed drawn. The fire flickered only because it had to. Still, the seasons turned without asking permission. Spring pushed its wet fingers through the cracks in the shutters. Summer lingered long enough to bake the earth brittle, and autumn returned the wind to its rightful throne. The village, which had once circled her like a warm shawl, moved on without her. The bakery changed hands. The post office closed. Children grew tall and learned her name only through half-remembered stories their mothers told in warning. Asterisk, that's the Thorn woman. Don't bother her. She lost everything. Asterisk. One morning, as Marla stepped onto the porch with a bowl of milk for a one-eyed calico, she saw something she did not expect. A new kitten, so small it seemed more spirit than flesh, crouched beneath the lilac bush that clung stubbornly to the side of the house. Its fur was pale as parchment, almost bluish in the dawn light, and one of its back legs dragged slightly behind it. It watched her not with fear, but with eerie stillness, as if it had been waiting. Marla approached slowly, bowl extended, and whispered a soundless offering. The kitten didn't flinch. It rose, limped forward, and drank. She named it Aisling, though she hadn't spoken a name aloud in years. There was something uncanny in the creature's eyes. One the color of storm glass, the other clouded like skimmed milk. Aisling was unlike the others. She didn't curl up to sleep on the windowsill or beg for scraps. She came and went like a tide, vanishing for hours, sometimes days, then returning with burrs tangled in her tail and the scent of dust clinging to her coat. Once, Marla found a scrap of wilted violet in the kitten's fur, though no violets had grown in Ember Hollow since before the fire. Another time, a flake of plaster. Another, a ribbon, faded pink and damp with rot. Marla told herself not to care, not to follow. But the house had grown unbearably quiet again, as it always did when the weather turned. The other cat slept more, curled in purring piles beside the hearth, and the ache in her hands made embroidery near impossible. One evening, just before dusk, Aisling appeared in the doorway, tail twitching, eyes wide and locked on Marla's. The air had grown heavy, dense with the smell of earth and something sweeter, honeysuckle maybe, or decay. Without knowing why, Marla rose from her chair and followed. She wrapped herself in Elias's old coat, the one that still smelled faintly of cedar and sweat, and stepped barefoot into the cold. The kitten moved quickly despite her limp, weaving through the underbrush like a silver thread, leading Marla down the slope past the quarry and deeper into the hollow than she dared to walk in years. Trees gave way to brambles, then to ivy-choked stone walls that seemed to grow from the ground itself. The light thinned, the wind stilled, and then in the distance, just beyond the reach of the last familiar path, Marla saw the blackened silhouette of the old chapel. It had been abandoned since before her mother's time, a relic of old prayers and older sins. The place had always felt touched by something neither holy nor wicked, simply forgotten. Its roof had long since caved, and the pews lay scattered like broken teeth, but the bones of the place remained. Marla hesitated at the threshold. Aisling slipped inside. For a long moment, she stood at the doorway, breathing in the hush. Her pulse tapped softly against her ribs, like a question she had yet to ask. Then she stepped forward, not knowing what she hoped to find, only that something had begun to stir again, like the echo of a heartbeat that had once been hers, waiting in the dust. From somewhere inside the chapel, a sound rose into the silence. Not a meow, not the wind, a cry, thin, human, impossible, and growing louder. The morning Aisling first appeared, the world was half-draped in fog, the kind that silences even birdsong, curling low across the earth like a breath held too long. Marla had been kneeling in the garden, coaxing early shoots in the thawing soil with cracked fingers and a weary patience that only grief could teach. The frost had finally broken, and though nothing bloomed yet, she tended the beds anyway, not for harvest but for the habit of care, for the rhythm of digging, of touching what was still alive beneath all the dead. When she looked up, mist clinging to the loose strand of hair around her face, the kitten was there, no rustle, no paw fall, just suddenly there beneath the drooping hem of her linen skirt, blinking slowly as if she had always been. Marla stared. The animal was smaller than the others she kept, barely weaned by the looks of her, but there was nothing frail in her posture. She sat like a sentry, tail wrapped delicately around her bad leg, which stuck out slightly behind her like a broken quill. Her fur was pale as moonlight, so fine it looked translucent in the mist, and her eyes, one a soft crystalline blue, the other clouded over with a pearly whiteness, met Marla's without fear. The older cats kept their distance, watching from under the porch, their bodies taut and wary. They seemed to sense something foreign in the kitten's stillness, something more wild and stray. Marla spoke without meaning to. "Where did you come from?" The kitten tilted her head slightly, but made no sound, no movement beyond the small twitch of her ear. Marla reached out slowly, careful not to startle her, expecting the creature to dart away like all the rest had done on their first day. But Aisling did not flinch. She leaned forward instead and pressed her tiny, damp nose into the callous palm of Marla's hand, and in that moment, something inside the woman, something brittle and dormant, shifted, not quite breaking, not quite mending, but cracking just enough to let in a sliver of something like warmth. That night, Marla made a bed for the kitten in the laundry basket, lined with one of Elias's old flannel shirts she hadn't yet been able to give away. The kitten sniffed the fabric once, then curled tightly into a small white comma and slept without stirring, her breasts so soft they barely moved the cloth beneath her. Marla sat nearby, the fire casting long, hesitant shadows across the floor, and watched her. She did not understand why this one unsettled her, why she felt as though she had not adopted the kitten but been chosen by it. She told herself it was nothing, just another stray, just another mouth. But her sleep that night was strange, filled with dreams she did not remember upon waking. Only the vague sense of walking through ruins with someone small and silent beside her. The days that followed were marked by patterns that defied her previous rhythm. Aisling did not behave like the other cats, who had long since adjusted to the sleepy routines of her household. The rising with the kettle, the midday sun that warmed the windowsill, the quiet evenings spent darning socks or sewing hems in the firelight. The older strays had their places, their invisible lines of territory and mutual avoidance. But Aisling refused those bounds. She wandered, disappearing for hours at a time, only to return to the cat flap with burrs in her fur and a strange smell clinging to her. Damp stone, dry moss, something faintly mineral, like the air just before a thunderstorm. At first, Marla thought nothing of it. She assumed the kitten had found some abandoned crawl space beneath the house or taken to napping in the quarry rocks. But one morning just after dawn, she saw Aisling sitting at the threshold of the woods, staring back at her, waiting. When Marla approached, the kitten stood, limped for a few paces, paused, then turned to look again. Marla hesitated. It was absurd, she told herself, to follow a cat. But still, she took a step. Then another. The kitten's ears twitched once in approval, and she moved ahead, her gait odd but confident, vanishing quickly into the underbrush with a swish of her pale tail. Marla only followed her as far as the edge that day. The woods were thick and damp, the kind of place where voices vanish and roots rose like veins from the earth. She felt a coldness seep into her fingers, not from the weather, but from a memory of how it had felt to wander through silence with no destination, back when the only thing she wanted was to forget she had ever known joy. She turned back, heart heavy, and scolded herself for indulging the fantasy that this strange kitten might be leading her somewhere worth going. But Aisling kept returning to the woods, and each time she looked back, it became a quiet game between them. Marla would open the door, and Aisling would wait on the stoop, tail flicking. She would walk a few yards into the trees, stop, glance over her shoulder, and disappear again. On the third day, Marla followed farther. On the fifth, farther still. She brought a shawl this time, and bread in her pocket. She followed the sound of twigs snapping under the kitten's feet, and the occasional, sharp chirp of a bird startled from its roost. The path, if it could be called that, grew narrower, more overgrown. Brambles reached out like claws. Marla pushed through them with hands that remembered thimbles, not thorns, and bled for it. She found herself walking toward a place she hadn't thought about in years. The chapel. Once, it had stood proud at the center of a small outpost village that predated Ember Hollow by nearly a century. Its stones had been hand-laid by men who wore devotion like armor, its bells cast from or mined by boys barely old enough to marry. The building had long since collapsed in on itself, left to rot after plague, and bad soil drove the settlers away. People said it was cursed, that the priest who died there had buried his sins beneath the altar. Marla had only visited once, as a child, before the roof gave way. It had felt strange, not evil, just forgotten, a place where nothing wanted to be seen. Now, it rose before her in silhouette, the forest holding its breath around it. Aisling darted through a crack in the stone wall and vanished into the blackness. Marla stood outside for several moments, trying to make sense of why her chest felt tight and her breath unsteady. It was not fear. Not exactly. It was something older than that, like being watched by someone she used to love. She stepped inside. What remained of the chapel was a skeleton. Twisted pews eaten by rot, stained glass shattered into kaleidoscopic dust, vines coiling like veins around the pulpit. The air smelled of damp and old wood, the scent of things left too long without remembrance. Marla called softly for Aisling, but there was no response. Only a stillness that seemed to deepen with every heartbeat. She walked farther in, boots crunching on broken tile. Then she saw it. Near the collapsed altar, half hidden beneath what looked like a torn church banner and the crumbling shell of a pew, something moved. Something small. Something alive. Aisling sat beside it. For one terrible moment, Marla thought the kitten had found a dying animal, some wounded fox or abandoned pup, and she braced herself for the blood, for the stench of death. But then the thing stirred and cried out, a sound that pierced the silence like a needle, thin, human, fragile, the kind of cry that split you open if you had ever held something helpless in your arms and failed to keep it safe. Marla dropped to her knees. Wrapped in a filthy cloth, face streaked with dust and sweat, lay a baby, no more than a few weeks old, its mouth open in a soundless wail, eyes wide and glassy with fever. It looked starved, sunken, its limbs little more than twigs. And yet it was alive, against all sense, against all odds, alive. Aisling looked up at her then, one eye blind, the other impossibly clear, as if to say, Asterisk, I brought you here. Do what only you can do, asterisk. The child did not cry like healthy children cry. It was not the sharp, lusty howl that commands attention, the urgent declaration of life insisting on milk and warmth. This sound was smaller, worn down, a threadbare whisper of pain with a broken edge to it. More like a breath than a voice, more like the sound Marla sometimes made in her sleep when the dreams pressed too hard on the old wounds. She knelt on the cold stone floor, the hem of her dress darkening with damp, and looked at the baby, blinking back a rush of disbelief so sharp it made her chest ache. She thought, absurdly, that she had stepped into someone else's life, that this couldn't be hers, that this couldn't be real. But it was real. The child was real. Its skin was mottled and pale, its cheeks hollow, its lips chapped into fine white cracks. Its eyes, though clouded with fever and weeping from their corners, flicked toward her as if drawn by the warmth of her nearness. There was something unbearably intimate in the way the gaze landed on her, as if the baby recognized her. Not her face, but her grief, her loss, the signature of abandonment that clung to her like a second skin. She reached out slowly, almost afraid her fingers would pass through the child like mist, like a ghost of what might have been. But her hand landed solid on the thin, shaking chest, and she could feel it there, the flutter of a heart, weak but defiant, stubborn in its rhythm. She inhaled sharply, a breath that seemed to rise from some deeper place in her, a place she had boarded up so long ago it barely remembered the shape of air. The bundle that held the baby was nothing more than an old woolen shawl, damp and stiff with mildew, wrapped hastily and tied with a fraying ribbon, the kind once used to cinch hymnals in Sunday school. It smelled of rot and sour milk. Marla peeled it back carefully, her hand shaking, and found that the child wore no proper clothes, just a thin chemise made from what looked like torn bedsheet, cinched at the waist with twine. The legs beneath were bare and dotted with insect bites. One of the feet was swollen, the skin stretched taut and pink. Someone had left this baby here, not minutes ago, but days, perhaps longer. Marla looked around, half expecting some desperate mother to step forward from the shadows, weeping apologies, begging forgiveness. But the chapel remained silent, watching her through its hollow sockets of broken windows. The pews were draped with years of dust and moss. A robin, startled by her movement, took flight from the collapsed rafters, wings brushing the damp air. No one else came. Aisling sat a few feet away, curled with her tail tucked neatly beside her, her mismatched eyes never leaving the child. There was no meowing, no pacing, no demand for attention, just a calm, eerie patience, as if she fulfilled her purpose and now simply bore witness to whatever came next. Marla shifted her weight, the stone biting cold through her skirt. Her knees ached. She pressed her hand once more to baby's chest, then moved it gently to the child's forehead. The skin that was far too warm, damp with sweat, and flushed a worrying shade of red. Fever, hunger, dehydration, and yet the baby lived. It clung to life like a stubborn weed between cracks and stone, fragile, misplaced, and somehow still growing. Marla's mind spun with old knowledge, half-forgotten memories of the midwife's advice, of books she once read aloud in hopeful preparation, of lullabies and feeding times and the weight of tiny bones in her arms. Her breath caught in her throat. That had been a different life. That had been before. She hadn't touched a child since the day she lost her own. Not once. Not even by accident. But something inside her was moving now, against her will and beneath her fear. A deep, primal instinct unspooling from the dark, warm places in her body where memory lived like sediment. She couldn't leave it here. That was certain. She couldn't walk away from this tiny, impossible life and pretend she hadn't seen. The thought of it, of turning her back, of climbing out of chapel and letting the baby's cries dwindle into silence, made her stomach seize and her vision go sharp with shame. She reached out again, more firmly this time, and lifted the baby into her arms. The child was lighter than it should have been. The bones felt like matchsticks wrapped in linen, but it was alive. She cradled it awkwardly, unsure where to place her hands, aware of the fever's heat radiating against her chest, of the faint mewling sound that seemed to vibrate against her collarbone. She whispered to it then, words without meaning, nonsense syllables in soft tones, the way one speaks to birds or frightened creatures. She didn't know what she was saying, only that her voice had returned, and with it, something else, something she hadn't felt in years. Not joy, not hope, something smaller. The beginning of responsibility, the beginning of claim. She didn't remember how she got back to the house. Later, she would recall only fragments. The kitten darting ahead to the woods, the baby nestled against her shoulder, the damp air that clung to her skin, and the feeling that each step she took was binding her tighter to the path she hadn't chosen but could no longer refuse. Her legs shook beneath her. Her hands were numb with cold and nerves. But she walked. The other cats scattered when she entered the cottage, the door slamming against the wind as she stumbled through. She laid the baby on the kitchen table, her best tablecloth spread beneath like a cradle. The light from a hearth flickered across the child's face, illuminating the yellow tint in the eyes, the raw rash on the cheeks. She boiled water, crushed herbs, tore clean linens into strips. Her hands knew what to do before her mind caught up. She moved like someone under a spell. That night, she did not sleep. She sat beside the fire with the baby in her arms, spooning drops of goat's milk and chamomile between its cracked lips, watching as the skin regained the faintest flush of life. She stripped the child's rags and bathed it in tepid water, humming broken lullabies beneath her breath. The bath revealed more bruises, tiny ones, the kind left by tight fingers or rough handling. Marla stared at them for a long time, her mouth pressed into a line of fury. She didn't speak aloud. Whoever had left this baby in that place had done, so to be rid of it, not to save it. That much was clear. She dressed the baby in a soft flannel shirt of Elias's, pinned clothes with clothespins. The sleeves were far too long. The collar swallowed the neck. But it was warm, and it carried the scent of safety, of cedar and thyme. The child whimpered once, then settled, eyes fluttering closed against her chest. Marla felt its breath on her collarbone, warm and fragile and rhythmic, and her own eyes filled with tears she had no words for. She held the child tighter. For hours, she did not move. In the soft glow of firelight, surrounded by dozing cats and the smell of old wood, Marla Thorne sat with the baby curled against her chest, her back aching and her mind slowly catching up to what her body already knew. Something had changed. Irrevocably. Her quiet life, her stillness, the slow fading she had curated like a garden of grief. None of it would survive this new, small presence. This child had arrived like a wound in a prayer, bleeding and blessed in equal measure. And she had answered, not with logic, not with permission, but with arms open. She didn't know the child's name. She didn't know if it had one. She didn't know where it had come from, or who had left it, or what would come next. But as the fire crackled low and the shadows settled like a shawl across the cottage floor, she knew this much. The baby had come to her, and she had not turned away. Outside, the wind shifted. Aisling sat on the windowsill, eyes fixed on the forest, watching, waiting. Somewhere in the darkness, something had begun to stir. By the end of the second week, Marla had forgotten what silence used to feel like. The cottage, once echoing with the kind of hush only grief could build, now breathed with a different kind of stillness. Fragile, filled with the soft sound of life trying to take root. The child, whose cries had grown stronger with each passing day, no longer wept from pain but from hunger, impatience, or the deep, unnameable restlessness that comes from being alive and alone in the world. Marla found herself moving to the house not as a ghost, but as a steward of warmth, of nourishment, of borrowed time. Yet beneath each moment of progress, a deeper unease grew, creeping slowly along the edges of her thoughts like frost beneath the door. She had not told a soul. Not one villager knew that, inside the cottage on the hill, a foundling had been taken in. Each time she considered the idea, speaking the truth aloud, stepping into the village square with the child in her arms, her stomach turned to stone. It was not shame, nor even fear of judgment, though she knew that would come. It was something quieter, stranger, rooted in the marrow-deep knowledge that Ember Hollow did not forget sins, real or imagined. They remembered who lost what and when. They remembered what you had once had and failed to keep. Word spread easily in places like this, where neighbors still handed off secrets with sacks of flour and measured morality by the noise of footsteps outside your window. They had long ago decided what kind of woman Marla Thorne had become. A widow in mourning, a childless stitcher who wore silence like armor. If they saw her now, cradling a baby with skin too pale and eyes too dark to be hers, questions would fall like ash. Who did it belong to? Why had she taken it? Where had it come from? Why had no one seen her with child? And worse, what did she think she was doing, resurrecting motherhood from a grave she'd already dug once? Each of these questions found her in quiet moments. When the baby slept on her chest, when the kettle whistled unattended, when she bent over the cradle she'd fashioned from an old apple crate and felt the heaviness of a name pressing at the back of her tongue, begging to be spoken. She did not name the child at first. Naming would make it real. Naming would bind it. And yet, by the third morning, as she gently wiped the fevered cheeks and hummed an old tune, one her mother used to sing when the wind moaned through the shutters, the words slipped free without meaning to. "Mercy," she whispered, her voice barely more than breath. The baby stirred. The name hung in the air like smoke. It wasn't a name she had chosen. Not exactly. It had simply risen from her, from somewhere old and tender inside her that still believed in things undeserved but given anyway. Mercy, not forgiveness, not grace, not absolution, just the simplest prayer. Let her live. Let me keep her. Let this not be another thing. I must survive. In the nights that followed, the fever broke, then returned, then broke again. Marla paced the floorboards with Mercy pressed to her chest, her arms stiff with exhaustion. She boiled thyme in fennel and water, steeped the cloths in the mixture, and laid them across the child's forehead. She crushed dried raspberries into paste, trickled the juice between Mercy's parted lips. She washed the sores on the baby's legs with warm brine and kissed each one dry with trembling lips. And each time the child stirred or whimpered or coughed, something in Marla coiled tight, the old grief reawakening as muscle memory, the terror of loss, the helpless fury of watching something innocent begin to fade. She did not let her out of her sight. The other cats learned to give her space. Aisling, ever silent, kept her perched by the cradle, her tail curled neatly across her paws, watching as if she understood what it meant to guard what should not have survived. The other kittens played at the edge of the room, avoiding the hearth where Marla now kept Mercy wrapped in layers of linen and wool. The fire never went out. Marla stayed up through the nights, dozing in the chair with Mercy against her breast, one hand cupped protectively over the child's back as if shielding her from the world. By the end of the month, the child began to grow. It wasn't much, not yet, but enough. The cheeks softened. The skin lost its sallow cast. The legs, once rigid and shaking, now kicked in slow, lazy arcs, the toes curling at the lightest touch. The crying took on new texture. Louder, yes, but also more expressive, more like speech waiting for words. She followed Marla's voice across the room. She gripped Marla's finger with fierce determination. And once, when Marla leaned down to kiss her forehead after feeding her warm milk from a linen-wrapped spoon, Mercy cooed. The sound startled her. It was not something Marla had ever heard before, not in this house, not since the silence began. It felt like sunlight breaking through a window long boarded up. But even as Mercy's strength grew, so did the danger of discovery. Marla found herself lowering the lantern when crossing the rooms at night, drawing the curtains tighter even during daylight hours. She avoided the village entirely, relying on what remained in her pantry and what she could forage from the garden. But spring crept slowly this year, reluctant in its thaw, and supplies ran low. On a cold morning, her last sack of flour empty, Marla stood at the table with her hands buried in nothing and realized she would have to leave the house. It was a short walk to the village, but it felt like miles. She bundled Mercy in layers, tucking her into the worn shawl that had once wrapped around her own shoulders when she mourned. Now it carried something else, something new and impossibly alive. She left the child in the cradle, kissed her brow, and whispered a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. "I'll be back. I won't be long." The village had not changed. The cobbled street still curved around the square like a tired smile. The bakery windows still glowed with warm light and the smell of yeast. The butcher still stood with his arms crossed in the doorway, squinting into the wind. People still nodded as she passed, polite but distant, their eyes flicking toward her as if searching for what had shifted. She hadn't been to market in months, but no one asked why. No one needed to. In Ember Hollow, silence was the loudest confession. She bought only what she needed: flour, sugar, goat's milk, soap. She ignored the comments about her thinness, the subtle raising of eyebrows at her reappearance. She didn't linger. She kept her answers short. She paid in coins that had long lost their shine. But still, as she turned to leave the market, she heard it, a voice, high and speculative, behind her back. Strange, that one. Swore off the world, then back like nothing happened. Maybe she's taken a lodger, or something worse. She never had children, did she? Marla's breath caught, and she did not look back. When she returned to the cottage, Mercy was sleeping. The fever had not returned. Her cheeks were warm, her breath even. Marla placed a bundle of food on the table and leaned against the wall, one hand pressed flat over her heart, trying to slow the thrum of panic that had followed her home like a shadow. They were watching now, listening. The village, once indifferent, had taken notice. She would have to be careful. She would have to protect what she'd built. That night, Marla stitched a gown for Mercy from the scraps of Elias's shirts. It was rough but soft and sewn with trembling care. She worked by firelight, her fingers remembering the shape of tiny sleeves, the curve of a collar meant to cradle a new neck. With each stitch, she thought of the child she had lost, how she'd once sewn a blanket with acorns embroidered along the edge, how she'd buried it in a box beneath the lilac tree when the baby never came home. This time would be different. It had to be. But outside, the wind changed direction. Somewhere beyond the woods, a figure moved along the edge of the chapel ruins. A man, hunched and hesitant, kneeling among the stones where Marla had found the child. He pressed something into the ground, a token, a sign, or perhaps an offering, and then stood, staring toward the woods as if waiting for something to answer. Marla began to speak the name aloud, not as a secret, not as a whisper, but as a song stitched into the fabric of her days. She said it when she lifted the child from her cradle in the dawn, when she wrapped her in wool for their morning walk to the edge of the orchard, when she pressed her cheek to Mercy's soft brow at night and begged the darkness to be kind. Mercy, the words softened her mouth, calmed her hands, and brought something into a room that had been missing for too long. Presence. Not just survival, not just movement through time, but presence. And it changed the shape of everything. With the naming came a ritual care that bloomed with quiet insistence. Marla found herself noticing the small things again. The way Mercy's fingers curled automatically when brushed, the furrow of her brow when the milk was too cold, the slow blinking gaze that searched for her whenever she left the room. The weight of the child against her chest no longer felt foreign or frightening. It was simply part of her now, a constant, the center around which her days slowly revolved. The nights were still long and anxious, fevers that rose without warning, coughing fits that sent Marla scrambling for herbs and prayers, but she no longer moved through them in fear of failing. She moved through them because she belonged to this child now, because there was no longer a version of her life where Mercy did not exist. The cradle Marla had fashioned from an apple crate was too small already. The child, once a bundle of hollow ribs and fevered skin, had begun to fill out, not with plumpness, not yet, but with life. Her cries came louder, her limbs more insistent, her eyes sharper with awareness. Marla adjusted the cradle with scrap wood, padding the bottom with an old petticoat and a pillow stuffed with barley husks. She carved a tiny wooden dove and tied it to a string above the cradle so that it would spin lazily when Mercy kicked her feet. At night, she sang again. Not lullabies, not always, but anything that came to her. A hymn from her childhood, a line from poem Elias had once copied into a letter, the melody of the wind through the orchard trees. The garden had begun to thaw. The soil, dark and thick with promise, invited her hands to dig again, to prepare for a planting she had not intended when the year began. She turned the earth each morning with Mercy swaddled against her back in a makeshift sling. The child slept best there, her ear pressed to Marla's spine, lulled by the rhythm of motion and the slow murmured words Marla spoke in the air like incantations. She told the baby stories, not fairy tales, but memories of Elias, of the way the sky looked the night he proposed, of the day she found a fox curled in the hayloft and coaxed it out with honey. She spoke of sorrow, too, of what it meant to wait for something and not have it come, of how silence could be heavier than stone. But she said it all in a voice that made it beautiful, because somehow in the saying, it became part of Mercy's inheritance, not just the grief, but the survival of it. Still, there were moments that undid her, small, sharp instances where the past reasserted itself without warning. One afternoon, as she sorted through Elias's shirts to find more cloth for baby gowns, she found a note in the pocket of his gardening coat. It was just a list, seeds to buy, measurements for a trellis. But it was in his hand, and for a second, the sight of it folded her in half with grief so fresh it seemed new. Mercy cried from the cradle, startled by the sudden absence of Marla's voice, and it was that sound that pulled her back from the edge. She wiped her face with the sleeve of the coat, kissed the paper as if it were skin, and burned it in the stove, whispering thank you to the smoke as it curled into the flue. She began to sew again in earnest, not for barter or sale, but for Mercy. Tiny gowns from worn shirts, bonnets from old curtains, socks in the cuffs of her woolen gloves. She found herself enjoying the work more than she had in years. There was no urgency, no pressure to meet a deadline or please a fickle bride. It was just her and the needle and the slow unfolding of care made tangible. Each stitch was a vow, each hem a promise. The garments were not perfect. She had grown stiff in her fingers, and some days the thread tangled more than it flowed, but they were real and they were hers, and they were Mercy's. The child began to smile, first in her sleep, then while awake, and the sight of it undid something else in Marla, something older than the fire, older even than Elias's death. It was a part of her that had believed she would never be looked at like that again, with wonder, with total wordless trust. Mercy would stretch her hands toward Marla's face, her tiny fingers grasping at air, and when they landed, when they touched the curve of her cheek or the slope of her nose, she would laugh, a breathy, bubbling sound that made Marla laugh too, even when she tried not to. It was as if the house itself exhaled with her, as if the walls had been holding their breath for years and could finally begin again. But as new life bloomed, so too did the reminders of loss. One of the elder cats, a ginger with a torn ear Marla had long called Bramble, fell ill without warning. He stopped eating, stopped moving. She carried him to the hearth each night, wrapped him in blankets, and whispered to him as she had to Mercy in those early fevered days. But the fire could not warm him. On the fifth morning, she found him curled beside Mercy's cradle, his eyes half open and his breath still. She buried him under the lilac tree, the same one that grew just beyond the window where Elias once stood with a cup of coffee and spoke of planting roses. Mercy watched from her blanket, her hands opening and closing around the air. Marla didn't cry. She placed a smooth stone over the shallow grave and etched the shape of a paw with the point of her scissors. It reminded her how thin the line still was between having and losing, between miracle and memory. Word from the village came slowly, passed by whispers and smoke. A widow named Myron left a bottle of goat's milk on her doorstep with no note. A boy from the forge brought a bundle of firewood and stood awkwardly until Marla handed him a half loaf of bread. There were no questions, no demands, but the eyes that met hers held curiosity, gentler than suspicion, but not far removed from it. They knew something had changed in the Thorn cottage. They felt it in the smoke rising from the chimney each night. They heard it in the lull of quiet music when the wind blew just right. And in Ember Hollow, change never went unnoticed. One evening, as Marla nursed Mercy beside the window, the last light pooling across the wooden floor, she saw movement at the edge of the trees. Not animal, not child, a figure, hunched and slow, paused at the broken edge of the chapel wall. He did not step inside, but stood in stillness, his head bowed, one hand clutching something at his chest. He stayed for a long time, watching, listening, then turned and vanished into the trees. Marla's breath caught. She rose, stepped out onto the porch, and looked toward the chapel ruins, her arms wrapped tight around the baby, who now slept against her heart. She knew that kind of stillness, knew what it meant to kneel at the edge of loss, knew the way longing could wear a man down to nothing. And though she couldn't see his face, though she did not know his name, she felt something shift in the air between them. A thread, loose but binding. A door, slowly opening. The snow came late that year, falling in heavy, wet clusters that blanketed the hollow like a second silence. For days it snowed without pause, swallowing fences, erasing paths, and muting the sound of the world to a low hum. Marla watched it from the window. Mercy pressed her hip, the child's breath fogging the glass in small bursts as she babbled to her own reflection. The cottage creaked beneath the weight of it, timbers groaning like old bones, but the hearth stayed lit and the soup stayed warm. And within the walls of that home, time took on a softer shape. The wind could howl and the world outside could disappear beneath the white. But here there was milk warming on the stove, the soft thud of a kitten leaping to the windowsill, the rustle of linen as Mercy kicked free of her blanket and reached toward the firelight. Marla had not seen the man again, the one who lingered by the chapel, but she felt his presence or the shadow of it in the days that followed. Sometimes, out near the orchard, she'd find tracks that didn't belong to any animal. Once, she saw a ribbon tied to the gate, frayed at the edges and damp from the melt, the same shade of pink as the one Mercy had been wrapped in. She took it inside and didn't speak of it, not even to herself. There were still more questions and answers, and for the time being, she was content to let the mystery hang unspoken between them, like steam rising off the tea kettle, fleeting, insistent, not quite ready to condense into form. But with the snowfall came necessity. Her stores had run low again, and though she stretched the flour and preserved what she could, there came a morning when there was no more sugar, no more cheese, and only a few spoonfuls of dried lentils rattling in the jar. Mercy had begun teething, her cries more frequent, her little fists clenched in frustration. Marla knew she needed something more than what she could forage or improvise. She needed milk, soft bread, something sweet to soothe the sore gums. She needed to go into the village. This time, she did not bundle the child in secret. She dressed her in the soft blue gown she'd sewn last month, the one with the wooden buttons carved from apple bark. She wrapped her in a proper shawl and slid her into the sling across her chest, tight and warm, and pressed her heartbeat. Mercy fussed only briefly, then settled thumb in mouth, her dark eyes blinking up at the white sky. The walk down the hill was treacherous with ice, but Marla took it slow, her boots crunching through the crusted snow, one hand on the rough bark of trees as she moved. As she neared the edge of the village, she saw smoke curling from chimneys, frost crusting the eaves, windows glowing with lamplight. Ember Hollow looked unchanged, but it wasn't. Something had softened in the space between them. Perhaps it was time. Perhaps it was a child. Perhaps it was her. She passed the forge first. The blacksmith's wife, Clara, stepped out onto the stoop with a bucket of ash and paused when she saw them. Her eyes dropped to the bundle in Marla's arms. A flicker of surprise. Then something else. Something warmer. "Child's gotten strong," Clara said, brushing soot from her skirt. "Didn't think she'd last the frost." Marla paused and nodded. "She's stubborn." Clara smiled, just slightly. "She'd have to be." At the bakery, Marla ordered 2 loaves and a jar of jam. The baker's apprentice, a girl of no more than 16, leaned across the counter and cooed at Mercy, who blinked in reply. "She yours, then?" the girl asked, not with suspicion, but with the eager curiosity of someone who still believed the world was more good than bad. "She's mine now," Marla said, the words more free than frightening. Outside, an older man from the tannery passed her and tipped his hat. A boy with red cheeks and mittens too large offered her a stick of licorice for the baby. No one questioned. No one accused. The village did what it had always done. It adjusted. And perhaps Marla, in her quiet way, had returned to it. Still, she didn't linger. She returned up the hill with her basket full, and her heart steadier. The air had changed. It didn't press down on her as it used to. It didn't silence her. It held her, now, in a way that felt almost like acceptance. That night, as Mercy chewed contentedly on a crust of warm bread and the kittens curled beside the fire, Marla allowed herself to sit, not out of exhaustion, but out of peace. But that peace was not without edges. There were still nights when Mercy woke crying from dreams she couldn't speak, her body twisting in the cradle, her face flushed with fear. Marla would lift her, hold her close, whisper soothing things into her hair. But some cries did not soften with lullabies. Some wounds, she knew, had been pressed into flesh too young to remember, but not too young to feel. Marla began writing again, scribbling notes in a ledger where she once tracked orders. Not numbers now, not lists, but thoughts, small reflections, memories, pieces of herself she wanted to save. She wrote about Elias, about the first time she saw the mill's roof catch fire, about the way her hands had trembled for days after she lost a baby. And then she wrote about Mercy, about the weight of her, the gravity of her, about the way one small life could begin to rethread the shape of grief into something resembling a second chance. By early March, the snow began to melt. Small rivulets ran down the hill, carving paths through the frost. The soil squelched underfoot, thawing slowly. Birds returned in cautious flocks, their song a tentative greeting. Marla opened the windows for the first time in weeks and let the air move through the house like a baptism. She washed every blanket, beat the dust from the rugs, aired out the corners that had grown musty in the long dark. Mercy learned to roll, then to push herself up on her elbows. She smiled more often, laughed with her whole body, delighted in the feel of her toes against the cold floorboards. Marla laughed too, quieter, but no less sincere. The cottage had never been noisy, but now it rang with music made of movement, of breathing, of belonging. And then came the knock. It was late afternoon. Mercy was napping. Marla had been sewing, her thimble worn thin, a new bonnet halfway stitched. The knock was soft, not urgent, not repeated, just 2 quick raps. She stood, heart tight. It had been years since anyone had come uninvited. She moved to the door, looked through the glass, and saw no one, just the shape of footprints in the thawing snow. A small package sat on the stoop. She opened the door and picked it up, wrapped in brown cloth, tied with twine. Inside, a bundle of dried herbs, yarrow feverfew, rose hips, and a small wooden carving of a bird. No note, no name, just a gesture, a gift, or a message. That night, after Mercy was asleep and the fire burned low, Marla sat beside the cradle and turned the carving over in her hand. It was simple but careful, a child's shape, but with an adult's precision. She set on the windowsill beside the glass jar of wildflowers Mercy had once reached for with greedy fingers. And as the wind picked up again, rustling the trees, Marla felt it. Something waiting beyond the forest. A truth rising. And someone, perhaps, ready to come back for it. It was just after the thaw when the man appeared again, not as a shadow in the trees or a suggestion in the mist, but as a figure with form and purpose, moving slowly down the hollow path in the pale light of morning. Marla saw him from the upper window as she changed Mercy's linens, his shoulders hunched beneath a long, weather-worn coat, his gait uneven but steady, the line of his jaw sharp against the blue-gray dawn. He did not look toward the cottage. He walked past it with deliberate restraint, eyes fixed on something ahead. Something buried in memory, perhaps, or grief. The chapel, she thought. He was going to the chapel. She stood still for a long time after he disappeared behind the orchard trees, her hand resting lightly on Mercy's chest, which rose and fell with a soft, rhythmic ease. The baby stirred and cooed, a fist curling around the edge of the quilt, and Marla forced herself back into motion. She folded the fresh blankets, hummed to fill the silence, and told herself the man was a stranger. that he was no different than any wanderer who passed through the village trail on his way to nowhere. But the lie was thin and it didn't last long. That afternoon, she walked to the chapel. Mercy was strapped to her chest, wrapped tightly against the wind. The forest had begun to green again, small shoots piercing the earth like timid declarations, but the air was still cold in the shadows. Aisling followed close behind, tail held high, her limp more pronounced on the uneven ground. Marla didn't speak. She moved as one summoned, drawn forward by something older than fear. The chapel looked unchanged, still broken, still devoured by ivy and time, but the air around it had shifted. The ground was cleared of debris. A circle of stones had been placed at the base of the pulpit. Carefully arranged, and in the center of it, a small cloth bundle sat wrapped in oilskin. She stepped cautiously into the ruin, her boots crunching on grit, and paused beside the altar. The scent of cedar and smoke hung faintly in the air. Someone had made a fire here recently. Someone had come here to remember something. She crouched beside the stones and reached out to touch the bundle, but paused. Her heart pounded. She could feel Mercy's breath against her skin, warm and steady, a living anchor. She rose slowly and turned. He was there, just beyond the arch of the doorway, standing in the sun with his coat hanging open and his face exposed. His hair was longer than she'd expected, darker too, streaked with silver at the temples. He was younger than Elias had been, but his eyes held the same heaviness, the same haunted weight of someone who had known great joy once and lost it. He didn't speak. He looked at her, then at the child, then back again. "You found her," he said. It wasn't a question. Marla stood still, her hands gripping the straps of the sling, as if she could hold time itself in place by force. "She was here," she said, "in the chapel, alone." "I thought she was dead," he said, his voice low and hoarse with something unshed. "When I came back, I thought—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "They told me she was dead." Marla watched him carefully. "Who told you?" "The woman who birthed her," he replied, looking down at his boots as if ashamed of them. "She left a note. Said the baby had passed. Said she buried her near the chapel and didn't want me to come looking." Marla said nothing. The wind stirred between them. Mercy stirred too, her head pressing gently against her chest, eyes fluttering open with a soft sound of confusion. "She's not dead," Marla said quietly. He looked up. "No." For a long time, they said nothing more. Marla felt the old instinct to protect, to shield, to turn and walk back into the trees with Mercy hidden against her heart. But something in his eyes kept her rooted. He looked not like a man coming to reclaim, but like one who had come to confess. "My name is Caleb," he said. "I didn't know. I didn't even know she was pregnant until after I left for the logging camp. I came back 6 weeks later, and by then," his voice cracked. "By then, there was nothing left of her. Just a note, the rumor. People wouldn't talk to me. They said she'd gone mad, that she'd been seen carrying something wrapped in cloth out into the woods, then returned empty-handed. I looked. I came here more times than I can count. I dug where the earth looked disturbed. I thought I was too late." Marla's hand shifted on the sling, and Mercy gave a small sigh. "You weren't too late," she said. "Not for her." Caleb stepped forward, but stopped short. She's all right?" "Truly. She's alive," Marla answered. "She's been sick, starving when I found her, but she's alive." "Is she yours?" Marla asked. "I don't know. I've only heard your side. There's still a grave silence where her beginning should be." He nodded slowly. "I wouldn't take her. Not from you. I wouldn't ask that." Marla blinked. "Why not?" "Because I wasn't there when she needed me. Because I didn't fight harder to find her. Because you were. You did. And you look at her like she's yours." The honesty of it cut her open. Caleb stepped forward, just enough that he could see Mercy's face. The baby blinked up at him, unafraid, and reached out with one hand, grasping at the air between them. He didn't touch her, but his face crumpled. His eyes shimmered. He backed away. "She's beautiful," he said. Marla nodded, her voice a whisper. "She is." They stood there a long time, and the silence was not empty. It was filled with the noise of breath, of wind, of new trust being stitched together in threads too fine to see. When at last Marla turned to go, she did not ask him to follow, but she did not ask him to stay behind either. She simply walked back toward the cottage with Mercy pressed to her heart, and Aisling weaving between her steps. Caleb remained at the chapel, but when she looked back once, she saw him kneeling again at the altar, one hand on the stones. The next day, a bundle of firewood appeared on her porch. The day after, a bag of oats. A week later, Caleb appeared at the edge of the orchard with a carved spoon in his hand and a shy, awkward smile. He didn't come inside, but he asked if she needed anything. And when Marla said nothing, only nodded, he left the spoon on the fence post and disappeared into the trees. She began to see him more often, tending to the chapel ruins, repairing the doorframe, stacking stones around a broken foundation. Once, she saw him holding a small bird with a broken wing, setting it gently on the edge of the well. Another time, he carried a tangle of wildflowers in his coat pocket and laid them beside the cradle of stones. Marla said little, but she watched, and Mercy watched too, her eyes tracking his movements with curious ease, her mouth opening in delighted squeals each time he appeared. Something was beginning to take shape between the three of them, fragile as spring frost and just as easily broken. But it was real. It was becoming real. And one evening, when the fire burned low and the baby slept between them in a patch of fading gold, Caleb looked across the hearth and asked, quietly, almost without breath, "Would it be all right if I stayed a while longer?" The fever came in the middle of the night, without warning, as so many heartbreaks do. One moment Mercy was curled in the crook of Marla's arm, the rise and fall of her tiny chest calm and steady, her mouth parted in the deep, dreamless sleep of the very young. The next, her skin had gone hot beneath the flannel nightgown, damp with sweat that chilled and steamed in turns, her breath catching in short. Shallow gasps that brought Marla's hand to her heart as if to still the panic before it overtook her. She sat bolt upright in the bed, the candle guttering on the windowsill as wind rattled the shutters, and all the warmth that had crept into her life over the past months seemed to slip from her body like water through a crack in stone. Marla touched the child's forehead and found it burning. Not the warm flush of exertion, not the heated skin of a child who cried too long and finally given into exhaustion, but the searing, unnatural heat of something wrong, something festering beneath the surface, silent until it wasn't. She tried to rouse her, murmuring her name, pressing a cool cloth to the back of her neck, lifting her gently into her arms and walking her across the room as if motion alone could shake her free from whatever grip had taken hold. Mercy whimpered once, a broken sound, then fell silent again. Her eyelids fluttered but did not open. Marla's hands moved on instinct, drawn from some hidden, ancient place in her memory, the one that had never entirely let go of what it meant to care for a child. She brewed a weak tea of elderflower and honey, crushed dried fennel between her fingers, spooned broth into Mercy's mouth drop by drop, though most had spilled out and soaked into the wool blanket she'd wrapped around them both. Her thoughts spiraled like wind through a broken chimney. Fever could break, yes, but fever could also devour. Children died from it every year, sometimes in a matter of hours. And Ember Hollow was far from any physician. The midwife had long since stopped climbing the hill to Marla's door, and even if she hadn't, what would Marla say? That the baby she found in the ruins had fallen ill, and now she feared history would repeat itself? That she couldn't bear to lose this one too? The candle burned low. Aisling curled beneath the cradle and did not stir. The other cats were silent. The room felt smaller than it ever had, the walls pressing in around the weight of Mercy's burning skin. Marla stripped the child down, cradled her gently against her chest, and whispered prayers she hadn't spoken in over a decade. She begged not for miracles, but for mercy, the name itself a plea now, fragile and quivering. Please, not again. Please, let her stay. I'll give anything. I'll carry anything. The storm came not long after. The kind of cold spring tempest that seemed to shatter across the sky in sheets, thunder rolling low and relentless over the hills. The wind slammed into the shutters like fists. Rain drummed the roof in a ceaseless rhythm. And inside the small house, Mercy's breathing grew more erratic, her skin clammy and her limbs twitching in fitful spasms. Marla fell helpless. She had no medicine strong enough for this, no knowledge deep enough, no strength sufficient to summon away the terror of watching a child you love slip away in your arms. She barely heard the knock at the door. The sound was faint, almost drowned beneath the storm, and had it come any later, she might not have noticed it at all. But it came again, a knock, followed by silence, followed by a knock once more. Slow, measured, human. Marla laid Mercy down beside the fire and covered her gently, then crossed the room and opened the door. Caleb stood in the rain, drenched to the skin, hair plastered to his forehead, coat dark and heavy with water. He held something in his hands, a bundle wrapped in cloth, tied tight with cord. His face was pale, drawn with worry, but his eyes were steady. "I heard her," he said, breathless. "She's sick, isn't she?" Marla stared at him, her throat tightening. She could not answer. She could only step aside and let him in. He crossed the threshold, knelt immediately beside the blanket, and pulled the bundle open. Inside were 3 glass vials, tinctures, bitter-smelling, dark as ink, and a tin of crushed dried leaves. "My grandmother was a healer," he said, not looking at her. "She taught me a few things. Enough to help, I think, if it's not too late." Marla dropped to her knees beside him. "What do you need?" He instructed her softly. "Quickly, boil more water. Dampen cloths. Tilt the baby's head, just so." He mixed the tinctures with honey, measured precise drops onto her tongue, massaged her hands and feet to keep the blood moving. His hands never shook. His voice never cracked. He worked with the quiet focus of someone trying not to make a single mistake, someone desperate to save what should have already been lost. For hours, they sat beside the fire, taking turns watching over her, coaxing broth into her mouth, wiping her face, singing softly when she moaned in pain. Marla didn't speak unless necessary. Caleb didn't ask questions. They moved as 2 parts of a single body, one handing, the other receiving, one speaking, the other answered without pause. The storm outside faded slowly, its thunder replaced by the quieter rhythm of wind and dripping eaves. But neither of them noticed the world beyond the room. Everything had narrowed to this moment, this child, this breath. Sometime just before dawn, Mercy stirred. Her eyes fluttered open. Only for a second, but they opened. She looked up unfocused, then blinked once and let out a small sigh. Not a cry, not a whimper, just a breath, soft and deliberate. Marla pressed her hand to the child's forehead. The heat had lessened, not gone, but reduced. The flush of her cheeks had faded to a pale pink. The trembling had stopped. She turned to Caleb and did not speak. She didn't have to. He saw it in her face. Relief came slowly like thaw. They didn't smile, not yet, not fully. But something released in both of them, an uncoiling of the tightness that had held them for too long. Caleb leaned back against the wall, his shoulders slumped, eyes closed. Marla covered Mercy again and tucked her closer to the fire. "Thank you," she said quietly. He didn't open his eyes. "She's your daughter," he murmured. "I only want to help her live." And in that moment, Marla felt it. Something rearranging inside her, something old giving way. She thought of Elias, of the child she'd buried in silence, of the years she spent walking through a house built of ashes. She thought of the kitten that had led her into ruins, of the crying that had pulled her back from the edge. She thought of Mercy, whose name had become more than just a name. It was a command, a hope, a second chance not just for a child, but for the ones who still breathed. She reached out, not thinking, and took Caleb's hand. They sat like that until the sky lightened and the birds began to call again from the trees. The sun rose slowly, shy behind clouds, but it rose. The storm passed, and outside at the edge of the orchard, the first blossoms broke open, trembling in the early breeze like small, fragile beginnings. The garden was the first to notice the change. Where before the soil had been still and sullen under Marla's careful tending, now it opened to her hands with quiet generosity, as though some long-withheld permission had at last been granted. The shoots that rose from the earth came early and eager. Cabbage, onion, kale, all pushing upward with a strange, silent faith of things that had known hunger and grown anyway. The frost retreated in slow ribbons, and with it the weight that had hung over the cottage for so many years. It didn't disappear, not fully, but it loosened its grip, and that was enough. Enough for her to wake without dread. Enough for Mercy to crawl across the floorboards with a laugh that scattered the cats into delighted panic. Enough for Caleb to return, each morning without knocking, carrying baskets of mended tools, salvaged planks, or handfuls of wild mint, as though he had always belonged. He never stayed long at first, and he never assumed. He kept his distance when the child slept, took his meals on the porch, and only entered when invited, which at first was rare. Marla still bore the shape of solitude like a second skin, and she wore caution in her voice, in the way she poured tea, in the way her shoulders never fully relaxed. But Mercy did not know that history. Mercy, who now stood with trembling knees and caught herself on the edge of the kitchen table. Mercy, who babbled nonsense with fierce insistence and reached for Caleb's hands with stubborn joy. Mercy, who had survived the fire of her own beginning, and now bloomed with a softness that made everything else seem newly possible. In the weeks following the fever, Marla found herself watching the world with a different kind of eyes. The laundry flapping on the line, the smell of bread rising from the hearth, the creak of the rocking chair at dusk, all of it carried weight again, not as burdens but as markers, rituals of presence. She began to make dresses again, this time not just for Mercy but for the other children in the village. Word had spread. Quietly, respectfully, a note appeared on her gate one morning. Signed in a loose scrawl of Myron, the widow with 5 sons. Asterisk, would you make a frock for Isla's girl? She's growing too fast in my hands to keep up. Asterisk beneath the note was a bundle of eggs, warm from the coop. A few days later, the blacksmith's wife sent a sack of barley in exchange for a pair of mended trousers. The rhythm returned, different but familiar, like hearing an old song in a new key. Caleb stayed longer each time. He patched the barn roof where snow had broken the beams, reinforced the cradle legs, and repaired the chapel door with salvaged iron hinges. Marlo watched him work, sometimes from the window, sometimes from the garden. He moved with the care of someone making amends not with words, but with presence. There were days when she wanted to ask him about the child's mother, what she had been like, what grief had done to her, but the questions never left her mouth. She knew enough already. That pain made people disappear, that sorrow made choices seem inevitable, that sometimes the ones who left didn't mean to abandon, only to survive. They began eating dinner together, first at opposite ends of the table, then side by side, Mercy between them with her fingers sunk deep in mashed potatoes or stewed carrots. Caleb brought stories about the northern forests, the logging camps, the men who cursed too much and loved too little. Marla listened, and sometimes she laughed. It felt strange the first time, like remembering how to breathe underwater, but he didn't comment on it. He simply smiled, and the space between them softened. One evening, after Mercy had fallen asleep in her lap, Caleb offered to take the dishes to the stream. Marla hesitated. Letting someone else wash the bowls felt intimate, almost vulnerable, but she nodded. When he returned, the plates clean and warm from the cloth, she took his hand and said thank you, not for the dishes, not just for the medicine, for all of it. He squeezed her hand once and didn't let go. They never spoke of what would happen next. There were no plans laid out, no promises etched into stone. But they moved together now, not in perfect synchronicity, but in a slow and patient rhythm. 2 people rebuilding not just a home, but the idea of one. Marla found herself placing his coat beside hers on the hook, setting out an extra cup without thinking. And when Mercy called out in the night, it was sometimes Caleb who reached her first, lifting her gently and humming low songs that made her quiet before her eyes had even opened. In early summer, the first tooth appeared, sharp and sudden, and Mercy howled like a creature betrayed. They took turns walking her around the cottage, around the garden, even down to the chapel where the trees had begun to bloom with pale pink blossoms. Marla held her as she wept and then laughed when the pain passed, and in those moments, she saw a glimpse of the future, not distant, not grand, just full. A table with more chairs, a floor scattered with toys, a child strong enough to run down the path without falling, a man who came home not just for the child, but for them both. They repaired the fence together. Caleb found old rails and Marla painted them white, one board at a time, careful and slow. Mercy crawled through grass nearby, chasing butterflies with squeals that startled the hens. At night, they sat beneath the lilac tree, now heavy with blossoms, and spoke of small things. The first frost, the new goat born at Clara's, the taste of lemon balm tea. Marla rested her head on Caleb's shoulder once, and he pressed his lips to her hair, saying nothing, asking nothing, only breathing. The days lengthened. The air turned soft and golden, thick with bees and the smell of fresh-cut herbs. Mercy stood unaided for the first time, both arms raised in triumph, and Marla laughed until her ribs ached. She lifted the child into her arms and spun her in a slow, clumsy circle as Caleb clapped and cheered, a sound not loud but full, as though joy had returned his body in pieces and was now, finally, whole. But joy did not erase the past. It did not mend the bone already broken, or erase the ache that lived in Marla's chest when she looked at the cradle that once held a different child. It did not bring back Elias, or undo the years she had lost to sorrow. It simply layered itself over the pain, not hiding it, but holding it differently. Where once grief had consumed, now it coexisted. Where once silence had felt like suffocation, now it felt like peace. And one night, as they sat together watching Mercy sleep, her mouth open in soft breaths, her limbs sprawled like a question answered, Caleb turned to Marla and said, not with hesitation but with reverence, "You gave her a life." Marla looked down at the child and shook her head. "She gave me one." He nodded. "Then maybe we saved each other." The wind shifted gently through the open window. The fire cracked low. Aisling jumped onto the windowsill and sat watching the darkness, tail curled, ears twitching. Far off in the woods, beneath the ruins of the chapel, a fox barked once, sharp and clear. And Marla felt it then, that the peace they had built would not remain untouched. That somewhere, just beyond the reach of their little garden, something waited. Not sorrow, not quite, but something that needed reckoning. Aisling began to fade in early autumn, though the signs were so quiet at first that Marla mistook them for the ordinary slowness of old age. The white cat no longer chased moths across the rafters or curled herself along the sill to watch the wind dance through the orchard. She slept more deeply, curled beneath the cradle or beside the hearth, her breath thin and even, as if she dreamed not of birds or mice, but of something deeper, something beyond the reach of fur and claw. She ate little. She no longer answered when Marla called her name, though her ears still twitched at the sound of Mercy's laughter, as if that particular sound still tied her to this world. Marla watched the change of the heaviness she had not felt since the first days Mercy came into her arms. Aisling had always been more than a cat. From the moment she had limped into the garden, wild and small and utterly unafraid, she had carried something other, something unseen, as though she were a thread pulled from fate itself and placed deliberately into Marla's hands. She had led her to Mercy, after all. She had led her to the ruins, to the infant wrapped in rags and silence, to the choice that had remade her. In the long months that followed, Aisling had never strayed too far, never stayed gone long. Even when she slipped through the trees or disappeared beneath the floorboards, she returned. Always, until one morning, she didn't. The day was soft and golden, the kind of gentle ending that summer offers when it finally begins to loosen its hold. Mercy was toddling unsteadily through the garden, her hands outstretched toward the sunflowers, her steps small and victorious. Caleb was mending the barn door, humming to himself. Marla was gathering herbs, braiding them into a loop to dry beside the hearth. She noticed the absence slowly, in the way the air settled differently in the room, in the strange hush that fell when no soft thump came from the window ledge, when no familiar weight circled her feet. She searched the house first, then the shed, then the chapel, where the stones had grown mossy and soft with disuse. She called her name until her voice cracked, and still there was no sign. Not in the tall grasses, not beneath the porch, not beneath the elder tree where Mercy liked to press her ear against the bark and listen to the wind. The whole hollow felt quieter for it, like a breath had been drawn in and not yet released. She found her just before dusk, curled beneath Mercy's cradle, her body still and small, as though she had simply fallen asleep in the place she loved most. There was no struggle, no blood, No sign of pain, just stillness. The final kind. The kind that asks no permission and leaves no farewell. Marla sank to her knees and lifted her gently into her arms. The fur was soft still, though the body beneath it was weightless. Mercy stood nearby, watching with her curious, solemn gaze, and reached out with one hand not to touch, but to acknowledge. Caleb stood in the doorway, his cap in his hands, his eyes dark and unreadable. They buried Aisling beneath the lilac tree. It was the same tree where Marla had buried the child who never lived long enough to breathe. The same tree beneath which Elias had once laid his head in the days before the mill fire, smiling at clouds and speaking of plans too delicate to survive the world. She laid Aisling into the earth with reverence, wrapped in the soft cloth of an old apron she had worn when Mercy first arrived. Caleb carved a small stone with the shape of a paw, and the word guide etched beneath it. Marla did not cry. Not then. The grief came later, slowly, in the spaces between motion. In the quiet mornings when Aisling's absence reached out like an echo, in the long nights when the cradle creaked with Mercy's dreaming, and the windows no longer held that familiar white shadow. Autumn deepened. The trees burned orange and gold. The air turned brittle at the edges. Mercy learned to say mama and star, and again she pointed at the moon and called it Ash, which made Marla's heart catch each time, though she did not correct her. Caleb stayed, not in words, not in vows, but in every action. He chopped the wood before she asked, braided her herb bundles when her hands grew tired, whispered stories to Mercy when the night stretched long. He had become not a guest but part of the house itself, as though his leaving would undo something too essential to survive the breaking. The chapel stood quiet. No more offerings appeared at the altar. Whatever weight had clung to that place had shifted. It was still ruined, still open to the sky, but the grief had been lifted from its bones. Marla visited sometimes, with Mercy on her hip, and stood in the silence, not to mourn, but to remember. She would run her hand over the stones, breathe in the scent of moss and pine, and speak nothing. Some places only needed to be witnessed, not spoken over. The village, too, had changed in quiet ways. Children wore dresses she had sewn. Bread came in baskets on the porch. Mercy was no longer a secret. She was a fact, a fixture. People greeted her with smiles, touched her hair with permission, offered her bits of hard candy, or worn dolls' missing arms. No one asked about her origins anymore. They had all decided, in the way of such places, that the truth mattered less than the living proof of her belonging. She was Marla's daughter. She was Caleb's child. She was a Hollow's own. One day, as the first frost gathered at the windows and the chickens began to sleep longer, Mercy fell asleep in the garden. She had been gathering leaves, chubby hands clutching red and gold, and she curled into a pile like a creature nesting. Marla found her there, her breast steady, her fingers wrapped around a stone smooth as river glass. She lifted her gently and carried her into the house, pressing her close, and as she walked, she whispered a thank you she did not direct at anyone in particular. Not the wind, not the chapel, not even the cat, just the shape of gratitude itself, unformed and overflowing. That evening, as the fire burned low and Caleb read aloud from a worn book, Mercy nestled between them, sleep-drunk and warm. Marla looked around the room and saw not what had been lost, but what had been built in the ashes. Not quickly, not easily, but deliberately, piece by fragile piece. There were ghosts in that house. Always would be, but they did not haunt. They watched. They softened the corners. They reminded her. When she finally stood up and took down the bundle of cloth that had once been Mercy's first blanket, she held it for a long time before folding it neatly and placing it in the cedar chest. It no longer carried the smell of rot and ruin. It smelled of lavender and wood smoke, of time, of life restitched. And then, without ceremony, she opened the door and stepped into the night. The moon hung low and golden. The wind rustled the dried stalks. And somewhere far off, beyond the orchard, a fox called once more. Marla turned back to look at the house. The windows glowed with firelight. Mercy's laughter echoed faintly from within, followed by Caleb's voice, low and warm. She smiled, and for the first time in years, she felt the smile in her bones. She had not saved Mercy, Mercy had led her home.